In this example, you're going to learn how to create a form and then instantiate that form inside a process and also route that form for approval. And let's go ahead and do that. And so the first thing we're going to do is we're going to create a new form. We're going to call this the leave request. We're going to create some labels and some text boxes to capture some data on this leave request. So let's go ahead and add a couple of labels. Okay, and let's call this label name. Let's call this one number of days. And let's also call another one, let's say duplicate, and we'll call this status. Okay, and now we're going to put some fields to capture data. So we're going to, let's put a text box. And let's call this txt name. Let's create another one for number of days. I'm going to make this small. And let's call it txt num days. And lastly, let's put a text box for status. And let's call this txt status. And we're going to also make this field read only. And go ahead and save that. And initially, let's set the value of this to be initiated. And next, what we're going to do is we're going to, since we're going to be routing this form, we need approval buttons, approve, reject. So we're going to use the form approval. And these buttons can be called anything you want. So let's call this insert complete task, approve, leave request. And let's call this reject leave request. That's all we need. We can go ahead and save this form. We can also do a little preview to see what the form looks like. So you can see that this field is read only and the other two fields are editable, and you can see the buttons also. Okay. Next thing we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and close this form, and we're going to design our process. So let's go to workflow definitions, and we're going to create a new process called leave request process. As always, when you deal with forms, you are required to define a variable that's going to hold that particular form, because you could be having multiple forms that you defined and using within a workflow process. You could have 5 different forms being instantiated and routed to 5 different people for data collection. So in this example, let's go ahead and define a variable. So we're going to define a variable called form ID, and it's going to be string. We're going to add that, and let's go to our form steps. So we're going to do forms, and one of the steps we have is to create a form instance. So what we're really doing is we are creating an instance of that form from the definition and then routing that form for approval. So let's go ahead and put this form step right here and connect it, and we're going to say we're going to select the form definition. In the next step, we are going to configure the form that we want to use in this step to instantiate. So in this case, we want to use this leave request form, and we want to store the form ID that gets created in the variable called form ID. And we're going to save that step. At this point, this step is going to instantiate the form. Next thing we're going to do is we're going to route this form. So we're going to use the route form step. And let's call this route to manager. And we're going to give the task name also route to manager for approval. And we're going to select a user. In this case, I'm going to select myself, the admin user. And I'm going to go ahead and save that. And here you can see that it's asking for the ID, form ID. So I'm going to use variable dot form ID. And you can also set, the task priority, how many days. Let's put 5 days to complete. And you can also set up email notifications and all that. And also you can hide certain fields and sections or subforms and make them read only and all that. So in this case, we're just going to route and we're going to save that. Then we're going to do the next thing. What we're going to do is we're going to set a field value. So we're going to use set form field value. If the manager approves this particular leave request, we're going to set the status field to manager approved. So we're going to use variable dot form ID. And we're going to select the form, leave request form. And we're going to do the mapping here. So if you look at this drop down, you will see these are fields and controls coming from the form. So we have a field called txt status, and we're going to set that to a field value. And the value could be, let's say, manager approved. And we're going to go ahead and save that. And we want this to only perform if the manager approves. So what we're going to do is we're going to click on this line and we're going to select completed. If it is rejected, we want to say manager rejected. So I'm going to go ahead and duplicate this. And I'm going to just put it next to it. And let's connect this line to here. And on this connection, I'm going to say rejected. And we also need to change the text in this mapping. So I'm going to say manager rejected. Okay. After this approval, let's say the manager approval, we want to route it to HR. So I'm just going to duplicate this step and put it down here. And we are going to change this to route to HR. And let's change this to HR for approval. And I'm going to keep the rest of the properties on this step the same and go ahead and save that. And we can do the same thing here also. We can set, based on the approval rejection. So let's say over here, we're going to connect it and say HR rejected. And if HR approves it, we're going to mark it as HR approved. And we're going to set this to be completed. Let me set this also to be rejected. Let's go ahead and change this also, saying HR approved. So as you can see on this particular workflow, we instantiate the form, we send it to approval to the manager. If the manager rejects it, we set the status of that field to be manager rejected. If he approves, we set the status of the field to be manager approved, and then it's sent for HR approval. If the HR rejects it, it sets the form field to be rejected, the status field. Otherwise, it marks the status field as approved. So now that we have the workflow, let's go ahead and test it. We're going to go ahead and save this workflow definition, make sure everything is okay. Let's close the workflow designer. And we're going to go back to our, we are actually going to create an instance now. Go to workflow instances, and let's create an instance. So you can see leave request process is selected. I can say generate name, and you can see it automatically generates a name. And I'm going to just say create and execute. And now the workflow is created. And if I just refresh my instance list, you can see that I have this particular item, instance created, and I can graphically render this by double clicking it. And you can see it got instantiated and now waiting on a task that is routed to me. And now I can go ahead and go to my task list. I believe if I look at admin user, you can see that I have the task list. And if I go ahead and select this user task, I can either approve or reject. So in this case, let me go ahead and put some name and number of days. And I'm going to say I'm going to approve this leave request. And you can see status is initiated. So at this point, the task is completed. If I go to my form instances, you should see a form instance created with a GUID. And once I can go ahead and edit this, or I can even just render it. And you will see John Hamill, 45 days, and you can see the status is manager approved. And if I go back to my task list, I should see another task now. And here you can see that route to HR for approval assigned to myself. I'm going to go ahead and render that task, and I'm going to say reject leave request. And if we go back and now look at the form instance, go ahead and view that form instance, you will see that the status field has the value HR rejected. And let's go ahead and take a look at what the workflow did. If I go to workflow instances, you can see that the process is completed now. I'm going to go ahead and render this process. You can see that graphically what happened. So we instantiated, the manager approved, so it went down this path. It set the status field to manager approved. It went down to route to HR for HR to approve. And in this case, HR happened to reject. And this particular step set the status of that status field to be HR rejected, and the workflow finished at that point. Hope you learn how to now instantiate a form inside a process and route that form, and also to set values within that form. Not only one form you can instantiate any number of forms and route them for data collection, for approval, and there are many form steps available in the toolbox to deal with forms.